I invite you to be seated. So, in case you didn't notice, there was a shift because after 2 months of sojourn throughout the whole of Easter season with what can be familiarly known as the adventures of the first Christians in the book of Acts, today we returned to using the Hebrew scripture for our first reading. Our lectionary cycle dedicates all of the summer and sometimes stretching on into the fall of each year to the reading of a single narrative arc from the Old Testament. Last year, if you don't remember, we worked our way through all of the stories of the patriarchs of Israel, Abraham and Isaac, Jacob, Joseph, and Moses, and then went on into the first generation of leaders once the people of God had made it into the promised land. Well, this summer, we are going to tackle the narrative arc of the ancient Israelite monarchy. This arc grapples with some really key questions in the evolving life of God's people. They're questions like, should we have a king or shouldn't we? How does how we answer this question affect our society, our future, and our relationship with God and with each other? And how do we deal with a king who fails to be a good shepherd for all of our people? These are the questions that our New Testament reading will be asking for the whole of the summer. And you know what? Despite our own modern rejection of a king over 200 years ago, they're questions that prove surprisingly timely for all of the things that we are struggling with around power and leadership in our world today. Now, when we left off, you have to think back all the way to before Advent. We left off reading the Old Testament with the story of Deborah in the book of Judges. Now, you remember the judges, there were a lot of them that were in our Sunday school lessons. There were people like Gideon and Samson. It was all that great drama. They made for excellent children's Bible stories. Judges were charismatic leaders. They were called forth by God from among the various tribes in response usually to a crisis. It was the kind of crisis where the people had abandoned God and were worshiping foreign gods. And they were often being oppressed by that same foreign power after some sort of military invasion. Now, judges, they were pretty special characters. They were humble, but yet heroic. And they were the kind of people that would get out there and lead to a heroic victory in some sort of final military battle where it seems like everything was about to be lost. And they always did that by calling upon the power of God to be with them in that moment. Then, after that, the judges would usually restore justice and the practice of Torah. I mean, it's excellent drama, right? After that, in the ordinary times that followed, these judges would adjudicate disputes with great and renowned wisdom, aka Solomon, and they would keep peace over a long, long life. Israel's judges generally did not amass any kind of great wealth. They didn't consolidate centralized dynastic authority. They didn't build huge castles. Still, there was this kind of unending series of rising military empires all around them throughout this era in history. Thus, this kind of cyclical pattern emerged where there was a crisis of invasion, there was a need for rescue, and there was a calling of a new judge generation after generation. It's the kind of predictability that's not really all that unlike one of those super long-running television series that I think we become used to, especially during COVID when we've all had lots of time to watch television. So if you think about it, today, where we jump back in, is kind of like one of those series on Netflix where they give you seasons 1 through 3, And then they skip 4, 5, and 6, and you're left to jump back in at 7, 8, and 9. We ended last November on a cliffhanger. Deborah, the judge, was poised for victory at Mount Tabor with God on her side. Well, we don't get to hear the end of that story. Instead, we pick up some 10 generations later with Samuel, who finds himself besieged not with a foreign enemy, but with the Hebrew elders standing in front of him and demanding a king. So, who is Samuel? And why are the elders so upset with him? Now, Samuel, if you think back, was a prophet first. He was the answer to his mother Hannah's prayers for a child. And he was raised by Eli in the tabernacle at Shiloh and called by God to be a prophet in the night. You remember, he's the one that answered, "Here I am, Lord." He grew actually into these twin roles of prophet and judge during what became an incredibly long conflict with the Philistines. At one point, they had even stolen the Ark of the Covenant, and he was the one that led the people to bring that back. Once the Philistines were finally defeated under Samuel's dramatic leadership with calling God to be with them in the last battle, he went on to rule as a judge through all of the days of his life. Now, by all accounts, Samuel was a good leader, probably even a great leader. The people listened to him, and he stayed true to the covenant with God. The problem is actually his sons. And you know what? Samuel was not the first judge to try to hand down some of his authority to his son as he ages. Eli did it before him, only with the same kind of unsatisfactory results. There was corruption, they were taking bribes, it's all the usual shenanigans. Well, the elders are fed up. They are tired of the behavior of Samuel's sons, and they're even more fed up with what they've now noticed is this ongoing cycle where there's this downside of weak leadership that brings about apostasy on the part of the people and then foreign generation. And it happens over and over and over again. So the elders lay down their ultimatum: give us a king so that we can be like other nations. Now, you can kind of see how this is, in fact, a tacit rejection of God. You see, God wanted the Israelite nation to be different from other nations. He called them to be his people, and he would be their God, and he wanted them to be a blessing for all of the other nations. He wanted them, in fact, to model how to be a community where the vulnerable are not merely trampled underfoot by the whims of pharaohs and kings and emperors, which was going on all around them. And you know what the craziest piece of all this is that I think those elders actually think that getting a king will make things right with God. You see, it's hard for us to get this because in our own more individualistic culture, everyone has their own personal relationship with God or their spirituality. But in most of the ancient Near East, it was a king who made his people right with their gods. Now, the evidence of this rightness was the king's great victories and his might and his wealth. And his subjects supported that rightness by bowing down to the monarch's unfettered power. The covenant that God made was different. It was a covenant with a whole people. It said, don't worship these gods of caprice and oppression. Worship me. I'm different. Follow my ways of love and justice, and share the means for fullness of life, even with the most powerless among you. You can see how this might take all of the people doing this to make this new type of nation a reality. Well, those elders, they are completely missing the point of being God's chosen nation. So God, not unlike many parents, says, all right, you may need to learn this for yourself, and says, yes, fine, I will let you have a king. But he doesn't miss the opportunity to say, and here's all of the ways that this is going to go horribly, horribly wrong. He says, your king will take your sons to make an army. Your king will take your daughters to feed and care for his court. Your king will take your produce to buy off his supporters. Your king will take your slaves and your livestock to work for him and build up his castles and all of that. And you know what? Your king, he'll take 10% of your flocks just because he thinks that he's entitled to them. In other words, God is telling them a king is a taker who never stops grasping for more and more power and everything that goes with that. Are you sure this is what you want? Says God. Well, the people, they don't listen. They say, yes, we want a powerful king with a big army who can defend us from all of those other kings. And, we can kind of see where this is going, can't we? Now, like a lot of people, they're like, we can do this king thing differently. They even developed this messianic idea that the kings of Israel should be different from other kings. They should act more like a shepherd than like a tyrant. Well, we have all summer to see how well that works out as we follow the reigns of Saul and David and Solomon. So fast forward about 1,000 years into Jesus's time, and you can see that the Israelite monarchy, it is not doing so great. In Jesus's time, well, they still haven't found that perfect shepherd king who repels all of the foreign invaders in battle and reigns with an equal measure of justice and compassion, caring for the needs of the powerful and the powerless alike. Instead, they are under Roman occupation. They have a puppet king who goes off and beheads the prophets instead of listening to their advice. They have a corrupt temple elite who are more concerned with their own status and the spoils that it affords them than the needs of the vulnerable who are literally sitting on the doorstep of the temple. That whole society at Jesus's time is a rigid hierarchy with set winners and set losers. Now, I think it's especially interesting that our summers being spent with the Old Testament monarchy is being paired up with Mark's gospel. In the very first chapter, Jesus proclaims the good news of God's kingdom has come near. But it's not exactly like he's talking about a king. You see, the Greek word that we often translate as kingdom, which is basileia, it doesn't point to a person like a king, and it's not really talking about a place like a nation. It's actually a word that's describing the quality of someone's actions. It could be better translated as something like God's reign, how God is acting with God's people. So, what is this good news of God's reign like according to Mark's gospel? Well, we'll find out as we work our way through much of the remaining 15 chapters, which we're also going to cover in the coming months. But I'm going to give you all a spoiler, because Elizabeth Struthers Melbourne in my Women's Bible Commentary summarizes Mark's gospel as nothing short of a complete revisioning of power. She says that God's reign is the time where God's realm is portrayed as making health and wholeness available to all. And it's the kind of thing that challenges and enables all people to join in that revisioning of power and in confronting the kingdoms of men that will try to stop this revisioning. Now, you can tell from today's reading how well Jesus' invitation to join in God's revisioning of power is going over as he's been doing his work. Jesus has a team of loyal followers that he's deployed because he can't get to all the people he wants to get to. And he's drawing huge crowds. I mean, Jesus is making waves wherever he goes. But you know what? His family, they think he's crazy. And the people who have been hoarding all the power in that rigid hierarchical system, they're starting to fight back by calling him out publicly and saying he's actually evil. He's from Satan. Jesus, well, he's comparatively sanguine in the face of all of this. He's not playing dirty politics here. But he does remind them in no uncertain terms that God's reign looks nothing like Satan's, and woe to anyone who makes this mistake. So, why should we, a people who threw off the shackles of monarchy 2 centuries ago, dedicate our summer to the ancient struggles over kingship and the nature of power in this long ago world? Now, we may not have kings, but if you think about it, we still have a lot of that same type of taking behavior going on in our world around us. We can see it all the time, the powerful hoarding might and wealth, while the powerless are just trampled in their path. So we're asking the same kinds of questions today, only I think we might word them something more like this. What models of leadership should we choose, and how much power and authority should we grant these leaders? How does how we answer this question affect our society, our future, and our relationship with God and with each other? How do we deal with leaders who fail to serve the needs of all of their people, especially the needs of the powerful and the vulnerable? And what is God's vision of power? And how are all of us called to participate in that vision? We are asking these kinds of questions all over the place. I mean, we're asking them in our political life as we navigate things like pandemic and polarization and witness this flurry of voter suppression that's happening around us. It's attempting to take away the voices of marginalized people who have been empowered over the recent years in our society, like women and people of color. We're asking these kinds of questions as we struggle to fully grasp the power that racism holds in our society and how to dismantle that pernicious hold. We're asking these kinds of questions with Me Too and all of the other ways that we're demanding that our places of employment be free from the kinds of abuse of power that have too long been tolerated behind their closed doors. And even in our church, we're using words like lay empowerment, shared episcopate, and a seat for everyone at the table to try to articulate how we too can better follow this vision of power for God's reign. And you know what? We're even embarking on some of the really hard work as a church, like grappling with the church's long and continued complicity with institutional racism. Now, I know that this is not just limited to these kinds of institutions. Everybody is struggling with and grappling with and doing work in these areas. Many of you are out there in your own places of work, in your schools, and the places with you where you serve in all of our community. You're out there challenging power that hoards and takes by using the power of God's love, working through each and every one of you to ensure that health and wholeness is available to all. None of this work is easy, but it's what God is calling us to do in this time and this place, just like God was 3,000 years ago. So, do we need people to act as kings, wielding unfettered power over others? Nope, we got that right. But that means that all of us have to exercise leadership and power like God would have us do it. Whether we better understand this as a covenant or the good news of God's reign, this is God's challenge to each and every one of us across every millennium. Seek justice, do mercy, walk humbly with your God. Amen.